We're looking at the workbook called Playback Button on a worksheet mixed names. Now, in column B here, and in column E, and in column I, we've got something similar going on. We're manipulating data by way of using different functions. So in column B here, we're using two functions called proper and trim that are cleaning up the data in column A. In other words, the proper function here only capitalizes letters that follow punctuation or space. The trim function gets rid of unnecessary spaces, and used together, we've cleaned up the data. We want to keep the results here, throw away the formulas, eventually get rid of the data in column A. We don't want these to be formulas anymore using those functions. We simply want the results. And the same thing here in column E, where we're simply making all letters be uppercase using the function called upper. Over in column I, it's a bit more complex. We're using a series of functions here, replacing existing information there based on location, using various functions, upper, left, replace, and right. And the key here is not necessarily to be understanding these functions, but to recognize that when you do clean up data using functions like these, many times what you want to do is to store these results. In other words, throw away the formulas. Now, manually, there are a couple different techniques for doing this, but if we record a macro to do this, we won't have to go through that multi-step process anymore. In other words, if we simply have these cells highlighted and record the process of turning them into the values that we want, we could use that elsewhere, and it could be really handy if you're cleaning up data frequently. And I do that myself, so I needed this macro, and I do use it a lot. So how does the process begin? Let's record a macro here, and because we want it to be available in all workbooks, we'll do something we haven't done so far in this course. We're going to be storing this in what's called the Personal Macro Workbook. That's a location where it's always going to be available anytime you open Excel. Now, I'm going to highlight these cells here first. Let's say that before we use this macro in the future, we will always highlight the number of cells we needed. And one advantage of macros is, for situations like this, is whether I record this macro with 2 cells highlighted or 3 or 5 or any number, the recording process is going to be the same, and it will work on any selected set of cells. So these cells are highlighted. Let's begin the recording process. Now we can do this 3 different ways, remember. We can start at the View tab, the Developer tab, or the button next to Ready in the lower left-hand corner. This time I'll start with the Developer tab. Remember, if the Developer tab is not present in the ribbon, right-click any other tab, choose Customize the ribbon, click the box for Developer over on the right-hand side, and click OK. It is available here. I don't need to do that. So I'm going to click Developer. Off to the left, Record Macro. Once again, the Record Macro dialog box. I'm going to call this Convert Formulas to Values. I'm not going to create a keystroke shortcut here because we want to show you how it might be better to have a button in the Quick Access Toolbar that's going to be available all the time. Store the macro not in this workbook, but in Personal Macro Workbook. Click OK. Now, these cells are already highlighted, and so at a later time, no matter how many cells we highlighted, this is going to work. What do we need to do here? Home tab, copy. Then from Paste, click the drop arrow and choose Paste Values. Now, a minor point here, we don't want to keep those marquee lights, the marching ants lights that we see here. We'll just press Escape. It's done. That's all we want the macro to do. We can stop recording. We could go back to the Developer tab. There you see Stop Recording. Remember, we can always go down to the lower left corner to the right of the word Ready. We can stop it that way as well too. So either way, we've stopped. So the macro has been recorded. Let's jump into Visual Basic, Alt F11. Now this macro was stored in Personal, and many times when you press Alt F11 and come into the world of VBA, the VBA window here, you're not seeing the code that you want to see. Remember, in the VBA project window, we have all open workbooks are represented here, as well as Personal Macro Workbook if you're using it or if it has been created. It has been. You'll see a plus over here. Let's click it. It has modules in it. That's where macros are stored. We'll click Module 1, double-click Module 1, and we'll see the macro that we just created. Here it is. I often will clean up the code that we see initially here. That's simply repeat of the name, so get rid of that. And there it is. We don't have a keystroke shortcut. We don't necessarily need one. This macro is available. Let's assign it to a new button in the Quick Access Toolbar. Now, macros that are stored in the Personal Macro Workbook, and notice that it actually is a file with the name Personal. It has the file extension XLSB. That's the name of the file. It's set up automatically. Now, when you record a macro and put it into Personal, you are either creating that file called Personal, or you're simply adding to it. So in the example here, the Personal Macro Workbook did not exist before. This is the first time I'm using it on this computer. Therefore, I am creating this file. It happens automatically. You don't have to manually do that. We'll stress that in later movies as well, too. So this particular macro will be available in the future to all workbooks, because anytime you open Excel from now on, Personal Macro Workbook will always be available. So the kind of macros that you think have wide applicability, you can store here. And even if they're in the other workbooks, you can move them from there to here as well too. This macro, as we recorded it, went right into Personal Macro Workbook. Therefore, it's there. We don't need to move it anywhere. I'll press Alt F11 now. Let's say that we want to use this in other workbooks at other times. If we right-click anywhere in the Quick Access Toolbar, we'll see a choice called Customize Quick Access Toolbar. We could choose that, or we can click the rightmost button. It's a drop arrow. Customize Quick Access Toolbar. Choose More Commands. And in this dialog box called Excel Options, choose Commands From. You want to choose Macros. And the macro we care about here is the one in Personal called Convert Formulas. We're not seeing its full name there. Let's add this to the Quick Access Toolbar. Now it has an icon there. If we don't like the icon, down below we'll choose Modify. We've got 181 choices here. I don't think any one of them would suggest Convert Formulas to Values, but we'll choose one. Maybe we'll just pick, here's a house. Might as well use that one. We can change the wording that will pop up next to the button once we see it. We can use pretty much the same name. We don't need to see Personal, or you might want to leave it there to remind yourself where it's coming from, possibly. And we can use spaces there if we want, Convert Formulas to Values if we wish. So we've got free form pretty much here in constructing what the pop-up tip is going to look like. Click OK and OK. So we've got some formulas here in this column. Let's say we want to convert them. I'm going to highlight the cells and I'll simply press that button and it's done. What do we see here now as we double click one of these? Nothing but the pure content. And these set of long formulas here, we don't want them anymore. They did the job. They created the new entries here. Let's highlight these and we'll press that button again. There it is. We don't necessarily need a keystroke shortcut and we don't have to remember it either, but the button is there. Now, as we open and close Excel, we might leave this button here all the time. It's just a question of how often we need to use it, and not a bad idea. And again, consider changing the look of the button if you wish. Now, Alt F11, let's go back in here. Nowhere in here do we see an address. And the term selection here that we see in the macro, selection.copy, means whatever cells were selected, it does the job. It copies that data and does the paste special that simply pastes the results of the formulas as we wish to see them there. So selection takes care of that issue regardless of how many cells. So as we press Alt F11 here, we could have highlighted this many cells or all of them as we did, or just a few, and it works just beautifully. So this is an example of two things. We're creating a macro that's being stored in Personal Macro Workbook. That means it's always going to be available. And we always have access to this macro by way of the button that we put in the Quick Access Toolbar. So different techniques here for using macros that we think have wide applicability.